Hello ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another thing where I talk about things. Once again today I am in the suit for yet another commission. I was given a commission to talk today about logical fallacies and some aspects of rhetoric. And the thing about logical fallacies is that they're one of those deals that there's really not a science for fallacies. They're just a thing that people kind of, they want to like put everything into models and say like there's these arguments and they're wrong for these reasons, therefore I'm correct. So we're going to talk a bit about fallacies and some aspects of rhetoric, and it's kind of interesting. The first thing I think I'm going to start with, because this is the most important, is the argument from fallacy. What this is this assumes that if your argument has a logical fallacy in it, that the entire argument is false, and the conclusion is false too. This is like to say if you use ad hominem in your argument, like if you say, you know, you're fat, therefore you're wrong, that the person can't be wrong because your argument had a fallacy in it, therefore the person that you called fat is totally correct in the end. This is not how this works. The person that you insult may in fact be wrong, and just because you insult them with an ad hominem fallacy does not make them wrong. That is an argument from fallacy. So this is the kind of thing that we get into with fallacies, is we have sort of like, they eventually fold in on themselves and it becomes a fallacy even to use fallacies within an argument. But still, they have some interesting things because a few of them have some neat psychology behind them. So that's what I'm going to talk about actually. Is more some of the interesting reasons why we even use these sorts of arguments, why they're compelling, and where they go wrong, kind of how they mislead us. So anyway, the first one on my list after the argument from fallacy is argument from ignorance. An argument from ignorance, that's when you have it's basically like I proposed Bigfoot, this notion that you can't prove something's not true, therefore it probably is true. This is the assumption, like I said in last week's video. I said, suppose there's a purple monster that lives in my closet. Now, if this monster is an expert at hiding the reality that it lives in my closet, there's no way that I can prove that it's not there, because it hides all the evidence. It doesn't want me to know that it's there. So, you know, there's nothing, I can't prove a negative. I can't prove that there's no monster. It's the same thing. If you assume that there is a Bigfoot, and nobody can find evidence that there is such thing as a Bigfoot, that doesn't mean that there is, you know, like, Bigfoot could live under the sea. And we would never know that Bigfoot lives under the sea. We could just find a fish and we would just name it Bigfoot, and from that point onward, yes, there would be a Bigfoot. Because Bigfoot comes in a lot of different fashions and forms, and people kind of imagine him differently. You can't really prove there's no such thing as Bigfoot, because if something doesn't exist, there is no evidence of its non-existence. It's impossible for a thing that doesn't exist to leave any imprint on the world. This is an argument from ignorance. This assumes that if we know nothing about something, that we can't prove that something isn't true. You get this a lot with kind of ideological stuff, where people want to say, like, oh, you know, there's a lot of things that people will argue in favor of. I suppose I shouldn't bring anything up because I'll upset any particular group. Arguments from ignorance are very popular. People really like them a lot because they're impossible to disprove. If you make an argument from ignorance, it's basically an untouchable argument. The reason why this is so potent is because when you can't discuss whether or not there's a purple monster in my closet, I mean, if you try to convince me that there's no monster, I can just argue with you relentlessly that there is. I can insist that one exists and that we really need to do something about it. And there's no logical thing that you could tell me that would prove to me that there's no monster if I really want to believe that there's none. So that's why people kind of like to use this fallacy, is because you can't disprove it. It's impossible. There's nothing that you can do or show or say that would make this one go away. So argument from ignorance. Begging the question, next on the list. Begging the question is one that's sort of, this one I see a lot. Like I mentioned a joke once in the Soul Reaver 2 Let's Plays, that I do go on Pull sometimes to check up on news. Sometimes Pull, I hate the site. Other times they have interesting news, and then I can go look up like the original source and see what they're reporting on. You know, it's like all of 4chan. You know, you never know what you're gonna get. Sometimes you get really useful stuff. Sometimes you get stuff that's terrible. But Pull is one of those sites that just really, it just upsets me sometimes, because I'll go there and I'll see people doing things, and they use so many of these screwed up rhetorical, like, so many screwed up rhetorical questions. One of them, begging the question, is when you pose an argument and you assume a premise, and the premise itself really needs to be examined. This is one that I've seen if Hitler was so bad, then why did people love him so much? This is one of those things that it says, well, you know, if the people loved Hitler so much, then he couldn't have been all bad, is a better way of posing it. It takes this premise, it assumes that the people loved Hitler, and then they say, like, so he can't have been all bad, maybe we villainized him too much. Like, let's consider that Hitler might be a good guy. And, but it turns out, it really begs the question, is where this comes from. Was Hitler actually liked by his people? And if you read a number of accounts that actually, he really wasn't that popular in many of his elections and so forth. He had the Gestapo, and the Gestapo had block leaders. That's what this is a thing that they did, is they had block leaders, and so every block, you know, they would have a area that was watched by a Gestapo member, and this Gestapo member would report on whether or not people were saying good or bad things about the Nazi regime, and if you were saying nasty things, then you got a visit, and they had a little chat with you about the kind of stuff that you were saying. And so people learned pretty quickly not to question the whole regime. Like, when they told you to cheer for Hitler, you cheered for Hitler, and that was how that worked. So his popularity, it comes from actually during the era of the Phony War somewhat, is during the Phony War they thought, they actually were aware of this issue with Hitler's. They knew that Hitler wasn't very popular. He didn't really have a lot of charm and a lot of charisma. He wasn't really a very good tactician, and they knew that he didn't have a whole lot of public support. So they thought for sure that the regime was going to collapse in on itself before war began. They were looking at Hitler and they were thinking that he was that unhinged, and he was. The whole regime did fall apart. But the problem was that Germany had a really strong, they were really nationalistic at the time, especially at the time, and they had a culture that was very focused around the military. And in fact, the military at the time was still angry at the prior government, and they believed that had they been allowed to continue World War I, that Germany would have eventually prevailed. And so the military was also kind of its own sort of branch of government in a way. It wasn't as directly influential as the Nazi Party was, but the Nazis and the military were constantly at odds. They were fighting all the time. The military really didn't like the Nazis very much, and they went back and forth. That was another thing that they thought was going to cause the collapse, but it just wound up being that the Germans were united enough. They were united enough in their desire to go to war and win back their lost holdings and get out of poverty and everything else, that they actually did go to war. And it really probably would not have mattered whether or not Hitler was in power or if it was anyone else who supported that whole thing. It was just that the Nazis were the radical regime that wanted to, that they got the Gestapo, and they wanted to attack these other countries, and the people did want to go to war. There was quite a lot of support for a war effort, mostly among political circles, but there was plenty of people in the general population that also wanted this too. So we get into that where you have, like, it begs the question where you say, if Hitler was, why was Hitler so popular if he was such a bad guy? And it begs the question, was Hitler actually popular? And when you really look into it, he wasn't that socially popular. He wasn't really that well liked by the broad populace. He wasn't even that well liked by the military or anyone in political power. But he did have a lot of scary control, and people learned not to mess with that too much. So, begging the question, you can't start with a false premise and then try to argue from there, because if people argue like, well, maybe Hitler used magical unicorn dust to make everyone like him. Doesn't really work. So anyway, though, that's begging the question. False dilemma. This is one that's actually really interesting. This one is used a lot. We see this in politics very commonly. A false dilemma is when you create two scenarios and you assume that there's only those two. These are the only two scenarios you can follow. We get this with the minimum wage debate, where people on the far right are saying things like, if we raise the minimum wage, we're going to get unemployment. So do you want low wages that you're going to starve on, or do you want to be unemployed? This is what you call a false dilemma, where they give you one of these two options and they say choose the lesser evil, whichever one of these you want. And the idea is to make it feel like you're getting a choice, and you can decide, like you can argue in favor of unemployment, or you can argue in favor of starvation, and sure, you get high wages with the higher unemployment, but you know, this is what you pay. Is you have to choose, what do you want to pay? What kind of suffering do you want to pay? And when you get into the unemployment debate, you actually find out, like, economists do fight over whether or not raising wages can cause a reduction in employment, or if they'll cause prices to rise and fall. And actually, it depends on the sector of the markets that you're looking into, because the way that a false dilemma works is it often takes a very complex question and it boils it down to like these terrible decisions, and you have to choose one or the other, and they make the one that they want seem the most appealing. They say like, well, you know, we have everyone employed at least, and they may be starving, but at least they're eating something, as opposed to being unemployed and now they have no money at all. This is the premise. But really, when you look at it, when you look at the debate with the minimum wage, you find that there are a lot of market sectors actually where people having more money can drive down prices. Things like, suppose internet service would be a good example. Suppose that we didn't regulate internet service in quite the way that we did, and that there was a lot of competing services for internet. And you wanted to start your own internet company. So that would cost you a lot of money, because you've got to lay down all these wires, and even if you don't, you know, maybe you've got to launch satellites, you've got to do this, you've got to do that. You have a ton of startup costs. So if it cost you like, let's say it cost you $1,000, this is totally unrealistic, but let's say it cost you $1,000, and you're going to have about 1,000 customers. Well, if you could just charge like one time, like everyone pays you like $1, all 1,000 of your customers pay you $1, then you've overcome your startup cost, you break even. After that, you can start bringing in profits. It's great. Well, the trouble is that if like half of your customers are making only 50 cents in a year and they can't afford to spare you $1, then you spend $1,000, and then you can only really sell to half of the population because the other half is too poor to afford your services. So that means you actually have to raise prices to overcome your startup costs. This is how economics gets rather complicated, is it's not just a simple supply and demand curve. There are some markets that follow the supply-demand curve, but the supply and demand curve is a really simple model. This deviation from the supply and demand curve, that's actually, people are like, oh, it's economics 101, you know, this is the basics, everybody should be able to get this. It's actually not true. You deviate from the supply and demand curve in economics 101. It is economics 101 to understand that the supply and demand curve is not consistent for every single business in the world. There are a lot of market sectors that become much less expensive when the broad population has more money. There are some sectors where prices would increase. Like, for example, housing. If you assume that there's a limited amount of land and a limited number of houses that people can live in, so for example, like they have much higher taxes in Scandinavia. Scandinavia has a much lower, they have less land, and so if you want to live in the city, it's a lot more expensive to own a house or to own land because there's less of it going around, and they have higher wages and so on and so forth. That's one of the ways that the cost of living is higher in a place like Scandinavia. But when you look into something that has like high startup costs like internet and so on and so forth, healthcare, things like that, they have lower costs. And that's because although they have a higher wealth from top to bottom, they can sell to a larger pool of people in services such as that. So the prices aren't all so in countries where people earn more, where the bottom rung earns more, not every single price is incredibly higher. There are a lot of prices that are actually about the same as what's in America, and it varies. It varies from market sector to market sector. So the false dilemma is that you can either have unemployment, or you could have unemployment and skyrocketing prices, or you could have starvation and poverty. And it's really just a false dilemma. There's actually, it's more complex. The whole question is more complex. You really aren't getting these two choices. You have a whole bunch of things that are happening. The question is more like, we could do this, and these prices would go down, but these prices would go up. And the bigger question is, among most economists, is not whether or not you're going to see unemployment in some areas and more employment in others, because employment can rise. It's, are you going to see net gains? That's what they usually want to ask, is how do you produce the highest number of net gains? And so that's where they get in the debate. It's like, if we raise the minimum wage, will we produce more net gains than if we leave it as it is? So, false dilemma. Not very compelling a lot of times. People kind of slip into that sort of thing a lot. Moving goalposts is another one that I put on there. I see this all the time. I see that guy on the internet all the time who's like, who will say something. This is when you get in an argument and somebody disproves your argument, and then you say, no, that proof is insufficient. I'm going to need better proof than that. And so the person then is forced to create a stronger argument. They have to go look for more numbers, more proof. And so this is one of those things, a lot of times I see this where the source is reasonable, but they don't like the source. They're like, oh, you know, CNN is a biased, you know, it's a biased news source. Find me one from this, like for example, suppose that you're really far, let's suppose you're really far on I don't know, let's suppose that you believe in Fox News, and so Fox News doesn't report on like left-wing stuff, and so let's suppose that you have a right-wing argument, and you say, you know, I'm not going to believe your argument until you find a source on Fox News supporting your views, and you find that Fox News really has no support. You move the goalpost, you create a more and more difficult task, and you say, like, of course CNN is going to report on this, and they're going to be biased, so you have to show me Fox News, because Fox News isn't biased towards your leftist views, things like that. That's moving the goalposts. But people actually misuse this one a lot. A lot of times they assume things that if you demand better evidence at all, then that's moving the goalposts. And a lot of times this is not true. When you get into stuff like statistics and, you know, the fact that statistics are so unreliable, when someone says, you know, like 90% of people are space aliens, and you question that statistic, if you say, like, I'm going to need, like, a really good source on that statistic, then they say, you know, you're moving the goalposts. Like, I have this study that shows, like, 10 people all agreed that they were space aliens. And you know, we have to do something about these space aliens. That's one of those where it's actually perfectly fair to ask for better evidence. You're not really moving the goalpost. You're just saying, like, this is a crap study. Like, I'm going to need a better study than this. So moving goalposts, that's one that I see abused all the time. I see that back and forth. Is you get people who do demand like that. Like, I want you to find a source that agrees with me, and that's the only way that I'll believe your argument. And then of course you also get people who get mad and they're like, oh, you're just moving the goalposts. You know, I found you a source. I found you a source that shows that 90% of human beings are actually space aliens, and now you're just moving the goalpost. You know, I'll never be able to prove this. This is unfair. That's one that I see a lot. Moving the goalpost, kind of one of those fallacies that, like, it really doesn't mean anything that it's a fallacy. Another one I like, no True Scotsman. This is one of my favorites, mostly just because of the image, the idea of the Scotsman. You know, no one is a true Scotsman is the idea behind this fallacy. This is created specifically very prominently among ideologies. You see this in every single ideology. And the reason is because every ideology has an ideal person that you're trying to live up to, whether you're religious or like ideological. It doesn't matter if you're a communist or a communist or a feminist or like a Christian or a Jew or whatever. Any kind of ideology, you usually have an ideal that you're trying to live up to. And the ideal, sometimes it has a specific person. Like, for example, if you're a Christian, you want to live after Jesus. You know, you want to follow what Jesus did. The question often comes up, what would Jesus do? And there's no true Christians, basically, because the thing is that Jesus was the Messiah in the Christian religion. You can't say that you are as good as Jesus, because that would be, it's blasphemy. You can never be as good as Jesus. You can never be quite as good as Jesus. You can follow in his footsteps as well as you believe, but you'll never be Jesus. You'll never quite be Jesus. And Jesus is the true Christian. He's the one true Christian. He's the ideal. And so you get into this, where this comes up in arguments is you'll say things like, you know, I don't like Christianity because Fred Phelps is a jerk. Fred Phelps, he died actually recently. But Fred Phelps, he used to protest the funerals of soldiers because we dropped the don't ask, don't tell policy. And so Fred Phelps said, all soldiers are gay, I hate soldiers, and I'm going to protest their funerals from now on. So Fred Phelps, a lot of people really disliked him, and so some people would look at Fred Phelps, and they'd say, Christians are bad, look at Fred Phelps. And the response then is that Fred Phelps, he's not a true Christian. You know, he's not really following the discipline of Jesus. He's not following Jesus. And the fact is that Fred Phelps, he is a Christian. He identifies as a Christian. He tells people he's a Christian. He speaks for Christians. Even though a lot of Christians don't want Fred Phelps to speak for them, the no true Scotsman fallacy assumes that Fred Phelps isn't part of your group and therefore should be disregarded in any argument against your group. And the no true Scotsman fallacy I find is really interesting because when you get right down to it, groups and group psychology is kind of a fascinating subject. It's like people get into cults not because they're unintelligent. They join cults because of simple reasons, societal reasons. It'll be things like, suppose you have a girlfriend and you really love this. You know, she's your partner, you know, she's your best friend, and she joins this sort of cult, and it's not really like, she doesn't join it because she's crazy. She's a wonderful person, but she joins because they agree with some things that she kind of agrees with. You know, like suppose that she really feels like the environment needs protection, and so she joins this cult that's really kind of focused a little bit on the environment. They talk about like problems in the environment, and it's sort of a movement that wants to fix the environment on the surface. And the problem is, though, she gets into it like a lot, and they sort of she makes friends, right, in this group, and the friends don't really like it when people don't agree with the group, because they've created sort of an us versus them situation where sort of if you don't agree with the group, then you're in league with the devil, you're destroying the planet. So you find that your girlfriend kind of gradually doesn't associate as much with her other friends, because her other friends are sometimes critical of this group that she's become a part of, and the group that she's joined really doesn't like that. And so her other friends aren't going to shun her. Like, they're not gonna be too mean about it that she's part of this group. But this group, this cult that she's joining, they will absolutely shun her. They will make her life a living hell if she doesn't sort of conform to their ideas. So she gradually just kind of quits associating with her old friends because of the stress associated. And pretty soon you wind up, because you're her girlfriend, you've got to make a choice now. You've either got to really kind of convert to these ways of thinking, or you've got to get out of her life, because her friends are all on her case, and they're telling her, like he needs to convert or he needs to go. Like, he's a jerk. If he doesn't want to support us, then he's evil. He wants to destroy the planet. Things like that. And so you get into this, and so then you wind up with the guy. He has to join the cult, or otherwise he loses his girlfriend. The guy winds up faced with kind of a serious challenge. He's got to figure out, like, what do I want to do? Do I want to submit to this ideology, or do I want to be my own person and lose my partner? So that's how cults actually kind of gain their strength. Is it's not so much through people being crazy. It's more just through, like, group dynamics are very strong. And so the No True Scotsman, it comes from that, is you get a lot of ideologies that have very strong group dynamics. And so they will do things, and they'll say, like you get the feminism stuff, where it's like, where they post things. This is actually something that's been used, is I've seen 4chan, just to torment the feminist movement. They started a few hashtags. One of them was End Father's Day, I think. If you go on 4chan, then they'll deny it up and down. You've got people on it. They're like, oh, they're just trying to pin this on us. But I'm pretty sure it started there. But anyway, though, like End Father's Day. They tried to do that End Father's Day. Like, men are too privileged. They don't deserve a day to celebrate dads or anything like that. And it's just, really, you could end Father's Day if you wanted, because I think it started off as a Hallmark holiday. It was an excuse to go buy Hallmark cards. But people kind of like it. It's sort of a sweet holiday. But it was a fake hashtag. It was just to see if feminists would pick it up and they would run with it. And it turns out that a bunch of them did, because they consider themselves in part of the group, and you get that sort of thing where you can't question the group, because if you do, you get shunned. And if all your friends are feminists and you get shunned from the feminist group, then you have no more friends. You're isolated. You're all by yourself. And this doesn't happen just with feminism. It happens with every kind of ideological group. This is something that's very, very common. It doesn't matter if you're Christian, Jewish, whatever. As soon as you start to question the principles of the group, you can be shunned from the group. And if you don't have friends outside the group, you've got nowhere to go. So the No True Scotsman fallacy comes up a lot, because you get into that sort of thing where it's like, well, these people who want to, like, end Father's Day, they're not really for equality at all, are they? They're trying to end Father's Day. And you get into that sort of thing where it's like, well, those aren't true feminists, because true feminists want equality. It's like, but they're feminists. Like, they support your views, you're feminist, whatever. And it's like, no, they're not trying to live up to the ideal. No True Scotsman. There's no such thing as a True Scotsman. Nobody in any group, everyone in a group are just people. Groups are made up of individuals. There is no true Christian. There's no true Jew. There's no true, feminist. No true communist. There's no true capitalist. There's no true anything. You'll find this just throughout every ideology. You will never find a true anyone, because the true follower of an ideology doesn't exist. They're an ideal person, a perfect person, and the perfect person does not exist. So, No True Scotsman fallacy, one of my favorites. Another one. Definist fallacy. I don't know if this one is very common. I just kind of like this. I was going through looking at these. This is one where you have to have a definition of something before you can even argue. This is like when this we get more from people who in pseudosciences or who are doing things and it's sort of like I have my own definition for a term and I'm gonna argue now for my stance. This is the one that I get into. We're talking about feminism where they talk about like rape culture and stuff like that, and you get into like, well, what is like you have to define. The definition changes from person to person, as some people are actually talking about real issues as we understand them when we talk about like statistics and things like that. And other people are redefining words so that they can argue in a much broader fashion, and that's the definist fallacy. That's when you like recreate a definition or you alter a definition so that you can argue about a subject in a broader fashion, and you're really discussing more than what most people associate with a particular definition. You're redefined the definition. Then it gets into this really bizarre, very frustrating, because then you start to say like, well, that's just not correct, and then you get, it creates a lot of confusion is what it does, and that's kind of intentionally what it does, is it makes it harder to debate at all. This is one of sort of obfuscation. It's not really so much to benefit the argument as it is just to make the argument harder to discuss. It's like when you talk to someone, you have no idea what they're really talking about. They could be arguing in favor of a real issue, or they could be arguing in favor of something they just completely made up. You have no idea. You have to stop and ask them, what is their definition of this or that? And then they'll tell you, and you'll find out that you were arguing like, you don't have an argument. There's nothing that you want to argue with this person at all, because they're fighting about something else entirely. So definist fallacy. And finally, the broken window fallacy. This is one that I see a lot, again, on Poll, because there are people who get into the highly ideological aspects of economy and so forth. Broken window fallacy comes from a parable that was proposed by someone, I can't remember. But anyway, it goes like this. A man's child breaks a window, and then he's really upset. He shouts at his child, why did you break my window? This is so freaking expensive. So everyone kind of consoles him, and they say like, well, windows get broken, but if windows didn't break occasionally, then how would the window repairman make a living? How would he survive? And so the idea is that it's kind of like, well, it's terrible and it's frustrating for you, but at least the window repairman continues living. This is the economy. This is the cycle of life. People die, and when you die, you're eaten by the bacteria, and the bacteria makes grass. The grass is eaten by caterpillars, and then caterpillars destroy crops, and then everyone starves, and this leads to more happy grass, which leads to more happy caterpillars killing everyone. So anyway, though, the broken window fallacy, it assumes that the economy is stimulated through destruction or things like that. It kind of justifies the concept of like I say, like you break a window and it's okay because stimulates the economy, you spend money. But the problem with this fallacy is that when you spend your money on fixing your window, you don't have enough money then to buy new shoes, or you don't have enough money to pay for other stuff. We get into this with health insurance more prominently. This is the issue that we have. Is we say, like, we need all these private insurers because they support the healthcare industry. Like, think of how great the U.S. healthcare industry is, and it's really not that great, but they say it's great. And anyway, though, they say it's great and that we need to support it, and if we don't have these high prices, then how are we going to support this industry? It's essential. And the problem is, though, is that when everyone is spending all their money on health insurance, they don't have enough money left over to buy new shoes or new clothes. And in fact, I've actually had this problem myself, as I recently signed up for the health insurance thing, for the health insurance law. And I don't know how much money I'm going to make, so I didn't really take any of the subsidies. And now I'm like spending an extra several $100s every month, like one or $200 extra dollars. And I realize, like, I need a new pair of shoes. And I'm spending like $100 every month. It costs me like $50 for a new pair of shoes. I can't buy new shoes. I'm spending all my money on healthcare, and the healthcare is doing me nothing. I'm like not really, I'm healthy. I'm not spending the money. The same goes for my car insurance. I spend $100 a month on car insurance. And it's like one of those things where like I never get in an accident. My car insurance company must love me. But I can't afford new shoes. I can't afford a new shirt. I have to save up a little bit longer before I go and I get those things. So ultimately, because I'm paying so much into insurance, I wind up not really being able to stimulate the economy in other sectors. Like the shoemakers don't prosper because I can't buy their shoes. I'm spending such a significant amount of my money on health insurance that it actually hurts my ability to support the economy, period. This is why monopolies and oligopolies are bad, because they start to price gouge. They will take something like, if you have an internet service provider and they're the only one in town, and they make you spend, like $600 a month on insurance, or not insurance, $600 a month on internet, and this doesn't happen yet, but who knows, Comcast is trying to merge with Time Warner. We'll see where things go in the future. But if this happens, then it winds up being that you spend all your money on insurance, you no longer have money to spend on other things. It crashes the economy because your entire wealth goes to paying for insurance and nothing else. And you shouldn't even be paying that much for insurance. Our healthcare costs are getting to be that way, where we have a broken window fallacy, where we're saying like, oh, we need all this money to spend on healthcare, and we have the highest healthcare costs in the world. Nowhere else on the planet pays this much for healthcare. We probably don't need to be spending this much. It's probably due to a lot of things that should be fixed and probably won't be, if you ask me. I don't think I think the politics is too there's too much money in it, to be honest. But that's actually the broken window fallacy. This is like, you spend so much money on health insurance, you wind up not being able to spend money on new shoes, new computers, new this, new that. You can't do things. You can't start up a new business because you can't afford to pay healthcare for your employees. So on and so forth. It causes so much damage that you wind up with a net loss. You're not stimulating the economy at all. You're killing it. So, broken window fallacy. Yes. Those are all the fallacies that I have listed. Like I say, they're not really the end-all be-all to an argument. They're just sort of a fun little model thing, things that you can put together and say like, oh, here's some common things that people say that are wrong. But I started with the fallacy from fallacies one at the top, because a lot of times they're not as you'd think, where if you have a fallacy, it doesn't necessarily mean your conclusion are wrong. They're all just models. Like, many models are not correct. Even a lot of scientific models are not correct. So you should never get too wrapped up in a fallacy and assume that it really has much to do with the argument at all. You really have to compare the arguments for what they are, and be more analytical than that. Yes, but anyway, though, that was my segment on fallacies. I hope that was fun, maybe a little educational. I spouted some. I have the tyranny over the microphone, so I spouted my own political beliefs. You guys may have different ones, but yes, there's still the fallacies can apply where I put them. Just that kind of meaningless ultimately. So anyway, though, I will catch you guys later.